Thank you so much, Gregors, for this nice introduction, and thank you also for inviting me to this very nice conference. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you today. And my talk is about production forestry, so we're now moving into another part of conservation and forests. And I will talk about a way to conduct forestry, which has been introduced some decades ago, and about the knowledge base on this, and also I will make some comments and reflections. It works. So first, a few words about myself. As Gregor said, I'm a Professor Emerita, which means I'm retired. I've retired some years ago, but I still work a lot, so I'm still very interested in science, conservation biology science. And the research that I've been conducting throughout the years is quite applied. I have been working a lot with practical issues in forestry and conservation. As I come from Sweden, I mainly work in a boreal environment. So this is especially in the production forestry of the clear-cutting forestry of the Swedish forests, which is quite different from Central Europe. I'm a plant ecologist by training, and I have been working a lot with issues that the foresters and the conservation community feels are important to know more about the knowledge base, the evidence base. And I'm also very interested in outreach, in communicating with the stakeholders, which I think is very important and which I have devoted quite some time to. So my main research interest, one of my main research interests the last years, or the last decades actually, since I've been working so long, it's something called key habitats, which are small areas set aside for conservation. So I've been interested in these, the importance of small areas for biodiversity. And I'm also very interested in something called retention forestry, which actually is the topic of my talk today, and I will go into that later. And as Gregor said, I have been using epiphytic bryophytes and lichens a lot as model organisms because they are very sensitive to environmental variation, so they are good study organisms. The last 10 years I have been also become interested in fire ecology because 10 years ago there was a big fire, a mega fire in Sweden, covering between 13 and 14,000 hectares, and it was production forest that was burning. Anyway, the fire ecology is, it was a big area that burned. It was production forest, pine dominated by Pinus sylvestris, and it was dominated by crown fire, very, very severe fire. So it's very interesting, this area, and I've been studying the vegetation dynamics in this. But this was just an introduction of me, and so I will soon go into, now I'm pressing the next slide. Hope it's okay. So what I will talk about is this retention forestry or retention approaches in forestry. I will tell about the ecological basis for this, and I will also talk about the knowledge base. I will tell you about a new description of the literature that we have recently finished, and I will also give you some thoughts for the future. So what are retention approaches in forestry? Well, It's part of a big movement or approach that, I mean, in principle, you can do forestry and conservation in two ways. You can have separated, which means that there are reserves and then there are plantations. So it's black and white. Or you could integrate biodiversity consideration into production forestry. And you can do that in different ways, but all this to integrate biodiversity consideration into forestry is very much about retaining structures when you harvest. And thus it's called retention approaches, and there are different terms also on this. And when it comes to retention approaches, there is a large focus on biodiversity conservation. You do this for biodiversity, but you could also do it to increase the value for different ecosystem services. You could do it also for sustaining the ecological functions and so on, but I will concentrate on the biodiversity aspect. So this started 30, 40 years ago, and so the idea behind is, as I said before, is to oh, it doesn't matter. Okay, thank you. So here, what I said, you could either have total separation between conservation and plantations, so you separate, you use different areas for this. Or you could have in varying degrees share of this, and of course this is the other extreme where you only have close to nature forestry and you really try to have a very high status for biodiversity. And then there are everything in between, there is everything in between here. So the retention approaches, there are a number of terms. What we see now very much in the literature is retention forestry, which actually was coined in a workshop that I was participating in this workshop. It was 2011, and we were a group of people from all over the world actually, and we said that why don't we call this retention forestry? And so it was coined and it has been used a lot. But also you see the term green tree retention. It was used mostly in the beginning. A variable retention is very much used in North America and also in Australia. Structural retention you can also see, for instance, in parts of Canada. Clear cutting with reserves is also a term that you see, and all this is about retention approaches. And I should say also that this started to be practiced within the clear cutting context, thus this clear cutting with reserves. So the focus has been very much on the clear cutting. And so what do you do? Well, actually it's like when a forester goes into a forest to plan what to harvest, he or she thinks of the best trees for wood production, what is needed for the sawmills and the paper mills, etc., but also what should be left to increase, to maintain the wood production. But when in retention you go out with the eyes to see what should I keep, what should I not log that benefits biodiversity. So it's sort of changing the way you plan. So you focus on what's left and not what is taken out. And it's not at all complicated. It's about the individual trees, the habitat trees, and of course the microhabitats that's associated with that. It's also about leaving groups of trees when you harvest. We often call it retention patches. It's about leaving border zones to lakes, rivers, mires, and also it's about maintaining and also in some cases creating dead wood. So these are the actions that are taken when you practice retention approaches. So how did it start? Well, if you look at the retention approaches becoming known within the scientific world, it was this man, Jerry Franklin, in Washington State in the US. He's still active as far as I know, although he's also retired, but actually maybe 15 years ago he was retired. He observed there was a big volcano outbreak in Mount St. Helens in the Washington State in the late 80s, and he's a forest ecologist, and he went there and he saw that there was this enormous legacy after the volcano outbreak with extremely much dead wood. There were just dead trees all over this mountain. And then he started to think that, well, if we are to have a more nature-like forestry, we must think about these things that are left after disturbance. And thus he started to think that how can we integrate this into practical forestry? And he was a very, very, very skilled spokesman. He almost became, I think, governor of California, so he's a very good spokesman to explain things. But he is also a good scientist, so he wrote a lot about this, and thus it became known to the rest of the scientific world. But I think you all know that this is not really something new. For instance, in Central Europe, these habitat trees, they have been saved by the foresters for different reasons, because they are beautiful, old, because they know there's some rare bird nesting in this tree, etc. So habitat trees has protection of habitat trees and special places in the forest has been practiced. But now, from Jerry Franklin and on, it has become a more clear concept. And also in Sweden, we were actually practicing retention from the 80s according to the law, but we didn't call it, we didn't publish it scientifically. So today it's common in different parts of the world, in North America, Canada, US. It's used in Northern Europe. It's also in Australia, so it's quite normal routine today. It's nothing special anymore. And it's important to know is that this is not, although it started in a clear-cutting context, it's not relevant. It's also relevant for it's relevant for any forestry system, because leaving the structures behind, leaving them unlogged, leaving the structures important for biodiversity, is the same thinking, whatever kind of forestry you practice. So in the upper row here, we can see, this is a continuous cover forestry system, which is leaving, with a continuous tree cover. And this is a clear-cutting system developing over time. And it's the same thinking. It's habitat trees that are left, dead trees, lying and standing dead trees. So it's integrating these components. So the ecological basis is also quite straightforward, or it's very straightforward. It's that we know that many species have these more or less specialized habitats. They have certain niches. And in the forest, there are many species associated with old trees, with special tree species, with dead trees, with specific microclimates within the forest. Could be some special sites with higher humidity, for instance, or some special hydrology, some special nutrient conditions of the soil that create special habitats. And it's about considering these niches in the forest. So this is a picture that illustrates what Jerry Franklin, when he explained this retention concept, he said that there are three important functions, and this is what he calls lifeboating. And lifeboating is, this is a clear-cutting context because he started with this. It's carrying over the species to the next tree generation. Meaning if you save tree patches or individual trees, there's a probability that some species will survive until the next generation of the stand. He also said that it's about dispersal. It's creating conditions for species to move in the forest landscape between these retained structures. And also he said that it's a way to make the production forests more structurally rich, to enrich the forest landscapes with these dead trees and living retained trees. So this is the three basic functions. And this has been developed later into more functions relating to ecosystem services and ecosystem function. But these are the main for when it comes to biodiversity. And I should say also that when Jerry Franklin was coining this, there was not so much talk about disturbance and disturbance ecology. And later, one of the main responses of biodiversity to these retention approaches is the insight from the scientific community is the importance of having these habitats in an open environment, which is really beneficial to many species. So by opening up but keeping the structures, you benefit many species. And this was not really recognized in the beginning, when there was most focused on these closed forest interior conditions. So I'm now going into a new study that we have just completed, just to tell you a little about the size of the scientific evidence base and what we did. And with I cooperate with a research program on retention at University of Freiburg. The program is called CONFOBI, and I've been working with the PhD students there to make a systematic review of the literature on retention. It's not a meta-analysis, so we focus on what has been published, what have people been studying, not the results, so it's not a meta-analysis. And since the students are specializing on different taxonomic groups, we put large emphasis on the taxonomic groups. And also since there are social science PhD students, the social science literature we have also reviewed this or looked at what has been published. And we did this with a common systematic review approach. As you know, you work in different steps, and then you finally get a number of studies. And we separated them into ecological studies and social science studies. And then we saw what have people been studying and where. So regarding number of publications, this is for the ecology publications. And as you see, there are most studies from North America. And there are also quite a few from North Europe, and also Germany stands out as having comparatively many studies. There are also studies from East Asia, from Japan, since they 7-8 years ago actually started an experiment on retention forestry in Hokkaido, in the northernmost island of Japan. A big experiment with many replicates. So what about the biomes? About equal studies in the boreal and the temperate biome. And when it comes to forestry type, as you can see, it's the clear-cutting system that has been by much more studied than the continuous cover forestry system. And not surprising, since it started in the clear-cutting context. Taxonomic groups. This is arthropods are most studied, followed by birds, and then we have mammals, and also so this is arthropods, this is birds, and this is multiple. When the studies have included several taxonomic groups, but arthropods is matching the. As you know, the arthropods are the most species-rich groups, forest groups, and so it matches this. But perhaps surprisingly, birds have been much studied because I know, Gregors, that there are rather few birds compared to arthropods, so they have been sort of over-studied, or they have been prioritized, the birds. And also the mammals have been, mammals, as you know, are quite few when it comes to species, but they have been also quite a lot studied. So there is an over-representation of some species groups, which we explain, of course, that the knowledge on these species, like birds and mammals, is good, so they can be studied. There is expertise on their exploration. So if we look at the taxonomic groups on different continents, we can see that in Asia there are many studies on arthropods. In Europe, there are many studies on lichens, and in North America, there are many studies on birds and also mammals and also vascular plants. And this matches the same thing that we study where we have competence to study, because in North America, they have, or rather in Europe, we have quite a good knowledge on the species that we have. We have good literature on species determination, etc. We have good expertise that can go out and do field work. While in North America, this is less so, and so they focus on these best known taxonomic group like vascular plant, mammals, and birds. So regarding the development over time, if we look at the studies in the continents, this matches what I have been saying, that studies started to be conducted in North America, and lately studies from Asia have emerged through this experiment in Hokkaido. And regarding the forestry type, it also matches what we know, that they started in a clear-cutting context, and then more and more studies on continuous cover forestry have been conducted. And also the publication year, not at all surprising that studies started very much as snapshot studies taking observation at one time occasion only. And then when the experiments were developed, there were repeated observations. So the time span included, of course, increases over the years. So there are a number of experiments on these retention approaches, and they are all made in a clear-cutting context. And what they do is they have, some of these experiments are really big, and what they have is totally clear-cut. They have intact forest without harvest, and then they have retention with different levels of retention, like 5%, 10%, 20%. And in Finland, they are really good at this. They have many experiments. In Sweden, we have only one. In Finland, not all these experiments are pure retention forestry experiments, but they are part of other treatments, like maybe they have sunburned plots and other treatment, and maybe they create dead wood, etc. And there are also some big experiments in North America. The largest one is Emond in Alberta. It's very, very big. They call it the largest forestry experiment in Canada. It has been running for almost 20 years with lots of studies. This is the Japanese, the Refresh on Hokkaido, which has actually this year been published. They have been publishing an overview of their results. This is, I've added this because this is the Confobi, the program that we are making the literature review. It's not a manipulative experiment in the sense that there are treatments that are different management done in different treatments. It's observational plots in the Schwarzwald, but still I added it since it's a type of experiment anyway. So when it comes to social science, the social scientists found, what they did was to separate these publications into three categories: those with a clear social science component, and those with where it was not central, and those where the social science aspects were marginal. And it's very clear in the retention forestry literature that the social science aspects are made by us ecologists in our papers, because we say that we tell about the history, we tell about the policy context, we try to interpret how this can be transferred to practice, etc. But it's embedded in the ecology papers. When it comes to with a clear social science component, it's mostly studies on forest economics. The cost efficiency, there are some studies on the cost efficiency of practicing retention, because it's usually associated with the cost, since when you leave a tree, there is no space for the production tree, so it comes with a cost. It can also decrease the production close to the retained tree. And also it's about behavior studies, about what determines if a forester retains trees or not. For instance, what do people think about this? And there are some policy analysis, some historical studies about the development of the retention practices. And also there are some on the aesthetics. What do people think about these trees being scattered on, or these tree patches? So the literature analysis is that, if I try to summarize this, it's that most studies have been made in North America and in a clear-cutting context. And there is a difference in the taxonomic focus between continents, which is explained by the knowledge background. And there has been an increase over time in continuous cover forestry studies, the East Asian studies, and also in the length of the time series. And there are few studies with a strong social science focus. And actually, the social science students explain this with, I don't know if there are any social scientists in the audience, but still I think it's very interesting, because what they say is that retention forestry is too small to be studied from a social science perspective, because the social scientists want usually a larger perspective. So they put retention forestry in relation to some other forestry systems and a larger policy context. So this is their explanation. Yes, so a few studies on social science. There are also, since this, maybe I forgot to say this, but there are many studies on retention forestry. Already 10 years ago, we made analysis of the literature, or we made meta-analysis and found many studies all over the world. And also there have been made reviews and overviews and meta-analysis, a number of these. Actually, we found 38 papers summarizing retention approaches in different ways. And I will go into one of these meta-analysis, which is the largest one so far, and which also, and these meta-analysis that have been made, I don't remember how many now, but of the 38, they might be 5 or 6 or so. The other ones are more narrative reviews telling about the retention practice. I will tell about the largest meta-analysis so far to give you an indication of what science says about the response of biodiversity to retention approaches. It was published 2014. It's a very large meta-analysis. I don't know, some of you might have made these meta-analysis, but this first author, Katja Fedrovitz, she was a postdoc, and she spent actually 1 year just compiling the information from the studies. First of all, extracting, of course, and then compiling and then analyzing. It's a very intense work and time-consuming work. So I took part in the study, and what we did was to, from the beginning, decide that we needed to separate forest species, forest interior species, and open habitat species. And I think Simon yesterday called them disturbance species, because they respond differently. So we separated into these two types of species, and we also included, there were lots of different taxonomic groups. And I will have very simple, I will try to explain the main result in a very simple way. So when it comes to the forest species, taking together all the data, when there is comparison with clear-cut, when nothing is left, and a stand where there are retained trees. So if we look at this, we see that these are all the species groups taken together, but they were largely the same response between the species groups, taxonomic groups. So both for richness and abundance, for forest species, this is better than this. And this is, of course, not surprising. It's better to leave trees than to have no trees. But at the same time, we as scientists have to sometimes show what we think is evident, but here is the proof. And for the open habitat species, the disturbance species, the comparison was between old forest and forest, the stand where some trees have been left after logging. And also for the open habitat species, this environment is also quite self-evident, better than the closed forest. So the conclusion is that the retention forestry system is beneficial because it's an intermediate between open habitat and closed forest. But it very much depends on what you leave, how much you leave, and this, so far, it's not possible to make a meta-analysis of the impact of how much you leave, because there are too few studies having this gradient. But in principle, this system benefits biodiversity. So the conclusions are then that retention promotes both forest species and the disturbance open habitat species compared to how we traditionally made this without leaving anything. And this is, as I said, it's only studies from clear cutting. And also, as a parenthesis, it's not, the deadwood species are not included because it was, there were too few data in this, so it was on the living trees and the tree patches. And I didn't show this, but the taxonomic groups have a largely similar response. And also there was some tendency, we did not analyze this as we felt there was not enough data, but there was a tendency for the forest species to increase the abundance and species-restricted abundance with the retained level. And actually how much to retain is very much debated, and it's usually the way it's done today, it's quite low levels. In Sweden, they say it's 10% on each harvested clear cut, but it varies a lot. I think 30% they leave nothing. So this is usually quite low. Some thoughts for the future specifically regarding this retention forestry. It would be nice if we studied more additional taxonomic groups. We did not include soil biota in our study of the literature, but we know there are very few, so it would be really interesting to look at the soil biota. and also go more into to not only look at biodiversity and conservation, but also on the ecological functions and processes. For instance, there are some studies on the effect on mycorrhizal fungi if you leave trees behind at clear cutting, and there are some studies indicating that the more trees you leave, the more species of mycorrhizal fungi are kept at the site. And there are also some studies on nitrogen retention. If you leave a border zone to a stream and you clear cut, then this border zone retains nitrogen from leaking out in the water. And those studies are very important, I think, to continue. The experiments, some of these great experiments are I mean, they have such valuable data. They are 20 years old, and as we know, we have to study this for at least 100 years. So let's hope that they can continue. And also, I think we need to establish new experiments in a continuous cover context, manipulative experiments, meaning that we could put dead wood in different amounts in the forest, in a selectively logged forest, or we could open up around habitat trees. We could study stands with different numbers of habitat trees, etc., etc. So there is much to be done there. And as always, we always say that we need to look at the landscape scale, and this is, of course, also the same here, that almost all studies are at stand scales, so there should be more landscape scale studies. And not the least, these studies are very difficult, but ideally we should study the whole forest landscape with different components, like if we have a plantation, if we have continuous cover forest, we have retention, we might have protected forests. What is the contribution of the retention forestry component in the landscape, to relate it to the whole picture? So this was what I wanted to tell you, and I want to thank all the collaborators, the great PhD students in the Confobi program. Thank you so much.